In the province of Hunan, 9 out of every 10 people have perished. This chilling line, recorded in a 1331 chronicle of the Yuan dynasty, captures the horror sweeping parts of 14th century China. Around the same time in Shanxi province, an official report described a mysterious pestilence. Quote, "Those attacked had hard lumps grow on the neck or arm like clotted blood. Whole families perished. In some cases, the victims spat blood suddenly and died." Such accounts, sparse yet haunting, hint at the catastrophe known as the Black Death, the Great Plague Pandemic, certainly did not spare the East. While Europe's 14th century plague is famously documented, the story of the Black Death in Yuan-era China unfolds in a more subtle manner, pieced together from imperial records, local gazettes, and later recollections. And so today, we're going to talk about that not often touched upon story, an exploration of how the plague may have ravaged 14th century China, what its trajectory and impact were, and how the Chinese people understood and responded to this nightmare in their midst. But we must picture the Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368, at the start of the 14th century. The Mongol rulers, having conquered China and much of Asia, presided over an empire that connected East and West in ways unprecedented. Trade and travel along the Silk Road flourished under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, linking the Chinese heartland with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Caravans laden with silk and spices regularly traveled between Yuan China and distant Persia. Mongol armies and envoys crisscrossed the steppes. This vast interconnectedness would become the unwitting conduit for the spread of disease. Environmental stresses were also mounting. The early 14th century saw natural disasters in China, locust infestations, droughts, and famine, all recorded in the Yuan chronicles. Widespread hunger weakened communities, and war and rebellion simmered under the surface of Mongol rule. It was in this climate of ecological and social strain that the plague found the most fertile ground. Welcome to the channel. Well, if the introduction didn't set the stage, it's going to be quite a chaotic exploration. This topic is not often talked about. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because a lot of the documents are not quite yet translated. But what we do have, we'll do our best to piece everything together. Allow me to welcome you to the channel first. Anybody new, I do invite you to click that subscribe button if you enjoy the content, and leave me a comment with your thoughts on the Black Death. And thank you to those supporting on the Patreon. You might notice that there's no ads in the video. Well, that's because of the gracious support that I get. Thank you. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. So where did this plague come from? Historical sources and modern research offer differing theories. Many medieval people in China and elsewhere simply saw it as the wrath of heaven, or a mysterious miasma. But historians have long speculated an Asian origin. Traditional narratives often pointed to Central Asia or China as the plague's cradle. In fact, an ancient DNA study published in 2022 may have pinpointed the outbreak's source to a location just west of China, tombstones in Kyrgyzstan. that is, in the Tian Shan Mountains of central Eurasia, dated 1338 to 39, bearing the inscription pestilence as the cause of death. And of course, surprise, surprise, DNA testing from those burials show Yersinia pestis, the very plague bacterium we have to blame for the entire situation. This evidence certainly suggests that the Black Death strain emerged in the 1330s around the crossroads of Central Asia, not far from the Yuan Empire's western frontier. It likely spread along trade routes, the same routes that had knit Afro-Eurasia together. Mongol-era merchants and soldiers could carry infected fleas and rodents on their baggage trains, transmitting plague over great distance. One Arab account by Ibn al-Wadi, written as the plague hit the Middle East, claims that the scourge arose, quote, in the land of darkness, then spread to China, India, and beyond, before finally reaching the Islamic world. And there is another scholar, the Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing a generation later, asserted that the entire nomadic tribes in Central Asia, quote, all perished without apparent reason in the course of pasturing their flocks and during their seasonal migration. All of Asia was depopulated as far as the Korean peninsula. Now, these foreign reports were based on probably hearsay and exaggeration. Asia was certainly not emptied of people, but they do confirm that the outbreak in the East was noted from afar. In essence, medieval observers believed that the plague journeyed out of Inner Asia in both directions, westward to the Middle East and Europe, and eastward into China. Modern genetics tend to support a Central Asian origin for the mid-14th century plague, a pathogen radiating out along the Mongol trade networks. Chinese sources do not announce, quote, the Black Death in bold letters. In fact, there was no single name for it then, and it left a fragmentary trail in the records. Yet by correlating various chronicles, we can trace a series of brutal epidemics striking China during the Yuan dynasty's final decades. The first reports surface in the early 1330s. In 1331, as mentioned, an epidemic devastated parts of Hunan, specifically Hangzhou. Consecutive years of drought were followed by a great pestilence, in which the dead were 19 out of 20, an expression indicating a mortality of around 95%. Well, this is an astonishing death rate, and while it may be an exaggeration or perhaps rhetorical, it certainly conveys the scale of horror perceived at the time. Such a calamity in Hunan, a region in south-central China, suggests that the epidemic disease was already erupting within Yuan territory around the same time the plague was brewing in Central Asia. By the mid-1330s, outbreaks are recorded farther north. Chinese chroniclers note that in 1333 to 34, severe pestilence raged in Hebei, the populous province around the Yuan capital, and also Shanxi province. One oft-cited statistic claims that 1334 saw a cataclysm in Hebei. Allegedly 90% of the province's population perished, with over 5 million deaths. Now this figure, 5 million dead in one province, comes from later summaries, and admittedly, it should be viewed with a bit of caution. It likely combines mortality from multiple years, or is drawn from dramatic reports, that being the old quote, 10 households, 9 empty, which was quoted in several reports. But still, even if not precise, it does indicate an enormous loss of life. If we are going to shave the numbers off a little bit, it still leaves us with a very grim picture. Contemporary evidence lends some credence. That report from Lu An in southeast Shanxi bordering Hebei describing hard swellings and people coughing blood corresponds to the plague's telltale symptoms: buboes, and in some cases, hemorrhagic pneumonia. The description of entire families wiped out in Lu'an suggests a highly contagious and lethal disease, consistent with the bubonic plague, which can also be transmitted person to person in its mnemonic form. Chinese writers didn't have the word shu yi, which basically means rat plague, shu being rat and yi being kind of like pestilence. But they didn't have this term yet, so that term for the plague would only be coined centuries later. But they did have phrases. For example, a great epidemic, we have Da Yi, and then we have Ge Da Wen, which is bump plague, and Tu Xue Wen, spitting blood plague. Quite literal descriptions of what they saw. Now, these colloquial disease names strongly hint at bubonic plague. Ge Da being boil, literally means a plague of lumps or boils in the context of Ge Da Wen. And then we have Tu Xue Wen, literally refers to an illness where the victim vomits blood. Now, although the Yuan records are terse, they do seem to be grappling with a new and ferocious sickness. Well, throughout the 1330s and 40s, waves of epidemics struck various parts of China. We see a patchwork pattern. Northern and central provinces were hit the hardest. A chronicle in the official history of Yuan mentions an outbreak in 1344 in the Huai River Valley, that is central eastern China, amid a terrible famine. This is poignantly corroborated by the personal history of Zhu Yuanzhang, a young man in 1344, who would later found the Ming dynasty. The Mingshi history of the Ming records that in 1344, during a year of drought, locusts, and famine, an epidemic struck. Zhu Yuanzhang's parents and elder brother died one after the other. Their peasant family, unfortunately too destitute to afford proper burial and coffins. While that source doesn't specify the disease, later commentators have wondered if the teenage Jew's family were victims of the Black Death spreading through the Huai Plains. It's certainly an eerie thought. The future emperor, a survivor of plague and famine, wandering China as an orphaned monk after 1344, because of the very pestilence that was ravaging Yuan China. We cannot know for sure if it was Yersinia pestis that killed his family, but the timing and the circumstances, they all seem to fit the broader pattern of the mid-14th century disaster of pestilence. By 1353 to 1354, the Yuan dynasty was crumbling, and an especially widespread epidemic wave is also noted. Chinese accounts, later collated by historians, indicate that in those years, plague spread to at least 8 distinct regions of China, spanning from the northeast to the south-central areas. The provinces listed include Hebei and Shanxi in the north, Hunan and Jiangxi in the south-central, Henan in the central plain, and Guangdong and Guangxi in the far south, among others. The toll was devastating in places. One report says over 2/3 of the population in parts of Shanxi had died, and 6 or 7 out of 10 people had died in Hubei. Even a few years later, in 1358, localized outbreaks continued. For example, in Shanxi and Hubei, over 200,000 reportedly died in that year alone. By the later 1350s, no corners of the empire were untouched. though some regions did suffer more than others. In 1359, a severe epidemic was noted in Shandong's counties like Juzhou, Yishui, and Zhejiao, and even in far-off Guangdong in the south, no one was spared. It is as if the plague struck in a series of pulses, rather than one continuous wave. An initial pulse in the 1330s, another in the mid-1340s, and finally the crescendo, a climactic series of pulses in the 1350s. These align loosely with the chronology of the pandemic elsewhere. The 1330s and 1340s in Central Asia and the Middle East, and the late 1340s in Europe, and the 1350s recurring regionally. But what is notable is that southern China appears to have been less ravaged than the north. Contemporary observers and later historians both remarked on this regional disparity. For instance, census figures, admittedly rough, indicate that the population of the northern provinces plummeted, whereas in the Yangtze Delta region in the south, the population held steady, or even grew slightly through the mid-14th century. Hebei and Shandong in the northeast reportedly had a 3.3 million in 1207 population, but only 1.1 million by 1393, a drop consistent with massive war and plague losses. In contrast, the wealthy Jiangnan region, that is the Yangtze Delta, saw less than 10% decline in the 1380s. Now what does this suggest? Well, if anything, it shows that the plague's penetration in China was uneven. The disease likely burned through densely settled farming villages of northern China, which had already been weakened by years of drought and military turmoil, while some southern communities fared better or recovered a little faster. It's possible, too, that the South had different ecological conditions. Perhaps fewer black rats in houses or different flea species, making bubonic transmission a lot less effective there. Whatever the reason was, the patchy geography of mortality in China is a striking contrast to the more uniform devastation seen in, say, England or Italy during the Black Death in the European context. But even if we do say that not every province was equally affected, the cumulative effect of these epidemics was no doubt enormous. You see, China's population had already been declining due to the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, but the 14th century plague pushed it to almost breaking point. There is one estimate that is often cited, and that is that China's population fell from around 120 million in the mid-13th century to roughly 65 million in the 14th. In other words, perhaps half of the population was lost over just a few generations. But of course, some modern scholars note that those figures might be somewhat inflated or incomplete. The Yuan government's census methods differed from the Song dynasties, or the early Ming census of 1393 likely undercounted people. For example, many war refugees or semi-nomadic groups were simply missed. Nevertheless, even accounting for data issues, there is no doubt whatsoever that millions of lives were lost to the convergence of war, famine, and pestilence. Contemporary Chinese writers didn't isolate plague deaths from other deaths. They spoke of a general population collapse in the late Yuan dynasty. The mandate of heaven seemed to be withdrawn from the Mongols by the late 1350s. Starvation, rebellions, floods, especially the Yellow River catastrophically changing course in 1351, and disease were all battering the dynasty. And just quickly, the mandate of heaven. Think of the divine right of kings. Well, once you have all the disasters and pestilences and all the rest, it's a sign that the heavens, or heaven in the Chinese vernacular, a little bit different to our perception of it, is displeased. The council of the deities above have taken away your divine mandate. Now, we'll have a little video about the mandate of heaven later on, perhaps. It takes a while to explain. But back to the topic at hand. All of these factors, the disease, the floods, the wars, it was a lethal combination. Many villages in North China simply vanished. Houses abandoned, fields left untilled. One later Ming source, reflecting on the yuan's end, noted that in some counties, quote, the dead were so numerous that there was no one to bury them. Wild animals feasted on corpses, and banditry became rampant amid the desperation. Although this is a very retrospective account, it shows that the sense of apocalyptic depopulation was very real in Chinese memory. Indeed, severe epidemics in the Yuan dynasty's downfall went hand in hand. The Great Red Turban Rebellion that erupted in 1351, eventually toppling the Yuan in 1368, drew strength from the outright misery of the common people. Many rebel leaders framed the chaos in religious terms, as evidence that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven mentioned earlier. One popular millenarian sect, the White Lotus, predicted the advent of the Maitreya Buddha and a new era, tapping into people's despair and hope for divine deliverance. It is easy to see how plague might feed such millenarian sentiment, when whole families were dying in agony, and local officials themselves succumbed. Surely, it must have felt like the end of the world. Some Chinese accounts from the 1350s describe eerily empty towns and skeletal populations. In Jiangnan, for instance, which suffered famine and smaller epidemics, the young Zhu Yuanzhang, who we've mentioned, leading rebel armies by the 1350s, could recruit followers among those dislocated by disease. And after the Ming was established in 1368, the new regime faced the daunting task of rebuilding a depopulated land. The Hongwu Emperor, that being Zhu Yuanzhang, instituted policies to repopulate northern China, moving tens of thousands of families into the empty North Plain to revive agriculture. These campaigns, the filling of the land left desolate in Hebei, implicitly testifying to the plague's toll. If war alone had been the issue, perhaps the land wouldn't have been so empty. In fact, the conquerors simply would have conquered it for a reason, put their own people in, tilled that productive soil. But it's pretty obvious it was plague, and plague magnified whatever devastation was already there. But how did the Chinese react to all this? Let's start with medicine. You see, Chinese medieval medicine was, for its time, actually quite sophisticated, but it interpreted epidemic diseases through its own lens. Chinese physicians did not understand contagion in the modern sense, but they had the concept of du qi and wen qi, the pernicious vapors and epidemic qi that could spread throughout the air, kind of like miasma, but a little bit more on energy lines. While a fast-killing epidemic fever with swollen lymph nodes would have likely been classified as a form of Wenyi pestilence, which is a general term for pestilence and not just for the Black Death especially, or perhaps a kind of heat disease, which they call reshaping, given the fevers and the rest of the conditions. There wasn't a unique Chinese medical treatise on the 14th century plague, in part because doctors at the time didn't really recognize it as a single new disease distinct from other epidemics. However, they certainly recognized its deadly nature, We know that in later centuries, Chinese doctors retrospectively identified certain historical outbreaks as deadly epidemics, possibly plague. By the late Ming, that is the 17th century, the physician Wu Youke developed a theory of pestilential agents after witnessing an epidemic, likely bubonic plague in 1642. He described a disease striking suddenly with a high fever and swollen glands, spreading person to person via a transmissible toxin in the air. Although Wu's work came 3 centuries after the Black Death era, it shows that the continuity of Chinese medicine throughout the plague was pretty stable. In the Yuan era, doctors likely treated patients with classical methods, herbal decoctions to clear heat and detoxify, lancing of buboes to drain pus, as Chinese physicians had long practiced lancing abscesses, and advice on avoiding bad air. There is some evidence that people burned aromatic herbs like mugwort, believing that smoke could purge epidemic miasma. Preventative measures might include fumigating houses with incense, or keeping a talisman for protection against evil influence. Unlike in the Islamic world, there was no strong ideological opposition to the idea of contagion in China, but there wasn't a developed germ theory either. The notion of something like person-to-person transmission was acknowledged in folk wisdom. For example, when one person in the family gets a pestilence, it was wise for the others to avoid them. Yet Chinese officials did not implement quarantines as the Italian cities did. One intriguing aspect of the Chinese medical response is the naming of the disease. Now, earlier I noted terms like bump plague, Gedawen, and the spitting blood plague. These seem to have been colloquial descriptors in Ming and Qing times for illnesses that weren't exactly the plague, but certainly fit the plague's profile. If such terms were in use among commoners in the 14th century, they didn't make it into the refined literature of the Yuan scholars. But later historians, and modern scholars like Cao Shujie, have retroactively linked those terms to the 14th century outbreaks. In any case, Chinese medicine's response was limited by the era's knowledge, much like in other parts of the world. No effective cure existed, just like in Europe and the Middle East. Healers likely did what they could, cooling herbs for fever, lancing and cauterizing swellings, perhaps using mercury or sulfur-based compounds. There are hints that some physicians understood certain practical measures, for example, avoiding contact with the sick or disposing of corpses quickly, but such measures would have been hard to enforce amid such a panic. Of course, like with anywhere else in the world, in the face of such inexplicable death and suffering, people naturally sought spiritual solace, or at least some kind of explanation. Traditional Confucian scholars tended to view disasters, including epidemics, as portents or punishments from heaven for misrule. So one can imagine the Confucian officials at the Yuan court, many of them Chinese ethnically, admonishing the Mongol emperor that the cause of these calamities of pestilence was basically his fault, signaling the loss of the mandate of heaven. Indeed, the Yuan government did carry out rituals to appease heaven when disaster struck. The Yuan emperors, being practical and syncretic, would sponsor Buddhist prayers one day and Confucian rites the next. When a great epidemic is mentioned in the Yuan history, it's often alongside the records of the court ordering prayers and sacrifice to heaven and earth, or decreeing a general amnesty, a traditional act to mollify heaven's anger. For example, there are instances in earlier reigns, 1313, etc., where the Yuan court held Taoist ceremonies to end the epidemic. but it's likely that during the 1330s to 50s waves, local officials organized rituals at temples, though specifics are pretty rare. But we do know that Chinese popular religion has a whole pantheon dedicated to illness, and that includes 5 plague gods, who were thought to spread or, if you were lucky, withhold the pestilence. Communities would perform exorcisms, parades carrying images of plague demons, the burning of effigies or offering of food to drive away the pestilence. Such folk practices were deeply ingrained. They date back to the Song dynasty and earlier, and surely were employed in Yuan times. A story from a later period gives a flavor. In 1350, as legend has it, a Taoist hermit in Hubei taught villagers to chant a charm to the heavenly master to ward off a deadly plague, perhaps an echo of what people did during the Black Death years. Buddhism also offered comfort. Monks and laity might chant sutras, like the Lotus Sutra or certain Dharani incantations believed to help in times of pestilence. The idea of karma was double-edged. Some may have seen the plague as karmic retribution for sins, while others emphasized compassionate deeds to earn merit and protection. Notably, Zhu Yuanzhang himself, after losing his family, spent years as a wandering Buddhist novice. One can imagine him, a survivor of plague and famine, seeking some kind of meaning and comfort in religion. Meanwhile, millenarian sects like the White Lotus blended Buddhist and Manichaean ideas, teaching that moral purity and devotion to the coming Buddha could save one from the disasters of the time. Some rebel proclamations even cast the plague in apocalyptic terms, a sign that the old world was finally coming to an end. As far as the Yuan government's response is concerned, it seems to be limited, or at least any response that they had was not well recorded. You see, unlike the Ming and Qing governments of later times, which established more systematic relief measures for epidemics, the Yuan state was perhaps overwhelmed and fragmenting under its own weight by the time the plague really struck in full force. They did have a system of local governance that included disaster reporting. County magistrates would report up the chain if a famine or epidemic occurred, sometimes asking for a tax remission or grain relief. There was evidence that in the 1330s to 50s, some areas received tax relief because so many taxpayers had simply died. For example, the Yuan history mentions certain prefectures excused from corvée labor obligations due to high mortality rates. This is a tacit administrative response, acknowledging depopulation and trying not to crush survivors with the usual burdens. But there were also attempts at maintaining order. For instance, when corpses were left unburied en masse, that posed a public order and sanitation problem. We have a clear example from a later dynasty that likely mirrors Yuan practice. In 1644, that is, the late Ming, when a plague hit Shanxi, officials in Beijing ordered, quote, temporary cemeteries outside the city walls to collect and bury the bodies, and provided funds for burial so that corpses would not be left exposed. During Yuan times, similar ad hoc measures were probably taken by some diligent local administrators. Mass graves or plague cemeteries set up to handle the swaths of dead. However, we should note that Yuan governance in its final years was deteriorating. Many local government offices, called yamen, were abandoned as officials fled rebellions or died of illness. Thus much of the immediate coping was just left to the communities themselves. But interestingly, one de facto response that occurred was actually migration. Survivors often fled affected areas, or refugees from one calamity, say famine, inadvertently spread disease to the other regions. Some Chinese records hinted people moving from the worst-hit northern villages to safer locales. This could sometimes slow the spread. If entire villages died or dispersed, the chain of transmission might break. But in other cases, it likely just carried plague along the roads, further and further. For example, the spread of the 1353 to 54 epidemic down the Grand Canal corridor could have been facilitated by boat refugees and merchant traffic, despite the chaos of war going on all around them. But what is really intriguing is to compare how the Chinese themselves recorded the events versus what foreigners imagined. As we have seen, Chinese documents are factual, but quite restrained. They log an epidemic and perhaps a mortality estimate or brief description. We have entries like, quote, many people died of the swelling disease, often alongside other disasters. There is no Chinese Giovanni Boccaccio giving us rich stories of individuals in the plague. This difference is partly genre. Chinese official histories prioritized concise accounts, and partly due to the overwhelming swirl of concurrent crisis in Yuan China. To a Chinese historian writing a few decades later, the fall of the dynasty, the battles, and the famines was simply just all tangled together with the epidemics. There was no single crisis to write about. It was just one big fire. The plague was just one thread in that larger tapestry of collapse. But from foreign perspectives, however, China loomed as the distant, almost mythical land where they believed the plague began. European and Middle Eastern writers, having no direct contact with Yuan China in the 1350s, using the land routes were cut by war and the sea routes were rarely travelled during the worst years, filled the gap with what was basically speculation. We've heard about Ibn al-Wadi and al-Makrizi. Additionally, European chronicles, such as the one by the monk Matteo Villani in Florence, mentioned rumours that in Cathay, that is China, and India, 20 million people died of the plague before it even came west. Now that's a staggering number. It shows how information got magnified in transmission. While 20 million is likely an exaggeration, it's not inconceivable that China and India combined lost that many. But Europeans had no data, just whispers from traders. Another foreign observer, the Genoese writer Gabriele de Musi, recounting the plague's arrival in the West, speaks of it originating in the land of the Tatars and of caravans of traders from the East bringing death with them. Even though de Musi never went to China, his narrative effectively blames the Mongol trade routes for the plague, which aligns with what we now know, the Mongol siege of Kaffa in Crimea in 1346, where plague-infected corpses were allegedly flung into the city by catapult. Another event linking the Asian epidemic to Europe. It's fascinating that a Chinese source mirrors this from the opposite side. We have one modern scholar summarizing Chinese records noting that merchants from Hebei carried the plague west along the Silk Road, transmitting it onward to India, Persia, and ultimately the Mediterranean. In effect, China's own historians acknowledged that the plague in China was part of the same transcontinental pandemic that struck Europe, a shared disaster in an interconnected world. But of course the question does remain, how clearly can we really trace the Black Death in the Chinese records? It's been a subject of pretty fierce debate. For a long time it was almost an article of faith that the Black Death had scourged Asia before reaching Europe. Modern historians often repeated that, quote, China was severely depopulated by the Black Death, contributing to the Yuan dynasty's fall. They cited the dramatic population decline snippets and like 90% dead in Hebei as evidence for this, and you can't really blame them. But in recent decades, some scholars have adopted a more skeptical view. Most prominently, George Sussman, in 2011, closely examined the Yuan dynasty sources and concluded that there is, quote, no specific evidence of plague among the many troubles that afflicted 14th century China. Sussman and others, including the historian Timothy Brooke, argue that while China certainly experienced epidemics, we should be cautious about labeling them the Black Death, that being the bubonic plague, without having clear proof. So, perhaps an eyebrow or two is raised, but if there's any sort of skepticism, we should probably unpack it a little bit. First, there is a bit of a lack of detailed symptom descriptions. Chinese records lack detailed descriptions for the outbreaks between the 1330s and 50s. We don't see explicit mention of telltale signs like black boils or rats dying off, at least not in the surviving sources of the time. The vivid Shanxi description of lumps and spitting blood was actually recorded in a local gazetteer in 1644, referring to what is likely a similar plague centuries later, and the customs service list entry for Lu'an may have been compiled long after the fact. This absence of clinical detail in contemporary Yuan texts contrasts with, say, Middle Eastern accounts that describe buboes and person-to-person contagions. Chinese historians mainly just noted the scale of the death, not the nature of the illness. Of course, then we have the pattern of the spread in China, which doesn't perfectly match the rapid contiguous waves seen in Europe. Instead of moving steadily province by province in a single epical sweep, the Chinese epidemics popped up in certain areas, north and central, while seemingly sparing others, southwest and the far south. Sussman observes that the epidemic in China might have been more localized and multi-causal, possibly a combination of diseases. Plague could have been one, along with dysentery, typhus, and other famine-related illnesses. If all these were plague, why did it apparently take years to travel from one end of China to the other? Some propose that the Mongol Empire's fragmentation by the 1330s disrupted the very routes that would have sped the plague's transmission, resulting in slower and patchy spreading in the east. But then we have some timing discrepancies. Europe's Black Death seemed to have peaked in 1347 to 51. If that same wave hit China first, one might expect China's peak mortality around early to mid-1340s. Yet the most extensive Chinese epidemic wave seems to occur in the early 1350s, with major outbreaks in 1353 to 54, after the pandemic had ravaged Europe, that is. But this raises the paradox mentioned by a 19th century scholar. China's soil did not feel the full effects until some years later. The plague had been carried to Europe. One speculation is that perhaps China's epidemics were a second or third generation offshoot of the original pandemic, meaning that the plague might have smoldered at low levels in Yunnan or in the borderlands and flared up later, independently, rather than arriving in one big crescendo in the 1340s. There was also the possibility that multiple strains were at play. Genetic studies show that the Black Death involves several lineages radiating from a common source. If one branch went west, it's pretty believable that another might have gone east, but took a different course. Of course, not all historians are convinced by the skeptics, me included. Many maintain that evidence, while not explicit, strongly suggests bubonic plague was indeed the culprit of the Yuan-era epidemics. They point to the sheer mortality, The references, however brief, to telltale symptoms like hard lumps, and the post facto logic that the same pandemic striking Europe and the Middle East must have also struck Asia, at least in some form. And one could argue, many have, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Chinese did not autopsy victims or trace rat vectors, so should we really expect a clear identification? What we do have are reports of mass death that align chronologically with the plague's spread. As one historians put it, what we know, then, is that major, highly lethal epidemics afflicted China in the 1330s to 50s, and undoubtedly contributed to a catastrophic population collapse. We hear only scant references in the south, and none in the west. If the disease afflicting China was the plague, it probably entered from the Mongolian steppe north of Hebei, and not from the Yunnan focus in the far southwest, excuse me. Well, this is a nuanced view, surely. Indeed, the words of Sussman himself acknowledging a case can be made, but it suggests that the plague did come into China, likely from the north via the steppe, since the first big outbreaks were definitely in Hebei, but that did not uniformly inundate the entire empire. Instead, it struck the densely populated north and parts of the center and east, while sparing the remote regions. The southwestern province of Yunnan, interestingly, is known to be a natural home of Yersinia pestis. Modern plague foci exist in the rodent populations, and it was the origin of the third pandemic in 1894. However, in the 14th century, Yunnan was a recent Mongol conquest, and if you look at it on a map, it is somewhat isolated. The available evidence indicates the 14th century plague did not originate in Yunnan's rodent nests, but rather came from the northwest. It's as if two plague reservoirs, one in Central Asia and Mongolia, and another in southwest China, weren't directly connected at that time. The plague entered China through Mongol heartlands, caused havoc mainly in the north and central zones, and then petered out before reaching the far south or west. But we should also consider that after the initial cataclysm, plague did not become endemic in Chinese cities, at least not to the same extent that it did in European ones. In Europe, plague reoccurred every decade or so for centuries after the Black Death. In China, we do see later outbreaks, for instance, major epidemics in the 1580s and 1630s, mainly in North China, that are indeed identified as plague, but they were sporadic. The 15th century in China, interestingly, had few recorded large epidemics. The population recovered significantly under the early Ming, doubling by the 16th century. This suggests that the particular conditions of Yuan collapse allowed the plague to rampage. But once those conditions changed, perhaps less warfare along the Silk Road, perhaps climate shifts, or improved governance, the disease just didn't circulate as freely. There is also an intriguing theory that the Chinese society's structure might have limited the plague's persistence. Chinese communities tended to bury garbage and waste, and that reduced rat infestations, and the traditional architecture, dispersed one-story homes rather than tightly packed multi-story buildings, may have somewhat reduced the human-to-flea contact, at least compared to those European towns. And another thing, after the initial wave, any surviving rats might have developed some immunity, and the most susceptible rodent hosts or human communities had been depleted. In summary, some scholars like Sussman do argue that the Black Death's impact in China has been overstated, or at least not proven. But they see the late Yuan period decline is primarily due to chaos and famine, with disease, if it was the Black Death at all, being a secondary factor. Others do contend that the pandemic truly did scour China and was a key factor in the demographic collapse. Our view today, which incorporates both historical and scientific evidence, leans towards acknowledging that plague almost certainly was present in 14th century China and caused devastating regional epidemics, even if it didn't quite mirror the European experience exactly. The lack of a singular, dramatic Chinese narrative of it may be due to simply how disasters were recorded, and the fact that it coincided with political collapse, making it a lot harder to disentangle cause and effect. Well, the Black Death, or whatever it was, eventually subsided in China by the 1360s, just as the Yuan state collapsed. When the Ming dynasty took power in 1368, they inherited a shattered economy, and regions depopulated. Ming records show the founders taking active measures to recover, which implicitly tells us the plague was gone, or at least at low ebb by then. Otherwise, they would have been dealing with the continuing outbreaks. The cessation of the plague in China is as interesting as its advent. Why exactly did it die out? Possibly the human population drop broke the chain of transmission, and perhaps the climate in the late 1350s turned unfavorable for flea breeding. There were some colder spells in the 1360s, that is. Oh, and another thing. Once the Mongol Empire actually fractured, long-distance trade temporarily contracted, ironically helping to smother the pandemic flame by reducing the movement of infected rodents and fleas across regions. But China did remain connected to global disease patterns. There were reports of plague in Ming China in the 15th century. But intriguingly, one hypothesis is that it might have been reintroduced from abroad. For example, the voyages of Admiral Zheng He in the early 1400s, which went to Southeast Asia, India, and Africa, have been speculatively linked to transporting plague-bearing rats, and some historians muse that rats on Chinese junks might have carried plague to India, or vice versa. Now that is a bit of conjecture, but it does show that the disease's movements did not respect political boundaries. Later, in the 17th century, when China had new outbreaks during the Ming-Qing transition, the wider world was again experiencing plague. The 17th century saw the last big rounds of plague in Europe and the Ottoman Empire. It is a reminder that these pandemics were truly continental in their scope. For the 14th century, we can envision the plague entering China via two main routes: the steppe route, Mongolia, Russia into northern China, and the Silk Road caravan route, that is, the Central Asia into the Gansu corridor and down to the interior. Both would deposit the disease first in the north and northwest. From there it jumped along the internal trade arteries, possibly the Grand Canal and river systems, to reach central and southern provinces by the 1350s. Conversely, Chinese caravans and merchants fleeing plague, or simply continuing trade, could have carried the infection westward. And so in this sense, the Black Death in China was both an endpoint and a source in the great pandemic web. It likely exited China in the sense that it waned in the east. It had already long since sparked the fires in the west. One poignant connection. While Europe was reeling in 1348, in the Middle East, the scholar Ibn al-Wadi wrote, "China was depopulated. India was depopulated. The land of the Uzbeks and the land of the Turks were depopulated. Mecca and Medina were touched." To him, China was the starting domino. Meanwhile, in China, perhaps some scholar in 1350 was writing that the plague was heaven's punishment on the Mongols, not knowing that far away, peoples also suffered the same fate. It certainly shows how the Black Death was truly a pan-Eurasian catastrophe, perceived differently in different locales, yet in hindsight, all part of a great, colossal event. And so, the whole story of the people of the 14th century China, whether Han peasants or Mongol nobles, thus shared in one of humanity's greatest tragedies, the story of resilience and despair, cultural reactions and imperial fall. It's an integral chapter of the Black Death, reminding us that this was a truly global event, long before the term globalization existed. In the end, the Black Death in Yuan, China, stands as both a historical reality and cautionary tale. It teaches us about the vulnerability of even the mightiest empires at the mercy of microscopic foes, the importance of accurate record-keeping, as we wish those medieval writers could have told us more, and the human capacity to endure and rebuild. By weaving together the Chinese annals with foreign chronicles and modern research, we gain a more complete and nuanced picture of the 14th century plague, not merely a European disaster, but a human one that spanned continents, China very much included. And just as we mentioned at the start of the talk, our little discovery in 2022, changing the narrative so completely, well, who knows what we're going to find in the years to come. Perhaps the entire story today will be completely different. Well, if it is, you know I'll be making another video about it. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed this one. I want to thank my top-tier supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Carrie, Charlene, Linda Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and, rather aptly, Guku Bubonic. Well, thank you very much for listening. And as always, I hope you learned something. Hope you came away with a better understanding. As always, lots of love to you all. See you in the next video. Goodbye for now.